in an era of sort of never-ending war, I don't. Vonnegut talks about looking back, and he talks about his failure of looking back as a pillar of salt. Is there any sort of, understanding that we can come away with when we start being confronted in an exhibition way with how we deal with war and image? Are we to the point where we can even make discrepancies anymore in an era that is ceaseless in its appetite for war, wherever that appetite stems from? Is there anything we can learn from this about war and about ourselves, or is this just a passing sort of rumination on things that, like Vonnegut, we look back on in somewhat of failure?
Well, there's a fantastic quote in Slaughterhouse 5 where he says, somebody asks him, he tells somebody that he's writing an anti-war book, and the guy says, you know what I say to people when I hear they're writing an anti-war book? And Vonnegut goes, no. He says, why don't you write an anti-glacier book instead? It's like, why try and do something against something that's so inevitable, that's so relentless, that's so powerful, and that seems to be so much more powerful than anything that might stop it, a glacier moving over a mountain or whatever. But I think Vonnegut, and it's the same as his statement about not looking back, he puts those statements in there and he's written the book. So it's not as if he says, people aren't supposed to look back. He didn't write it in the newspaper. Dear sir, people aren't supposed to look back, therefore I haven't written Slaughterhouse 5. He does write the book, and he comes up with a really amazing way of writing the book, and he comes up with a book that and this is something that Americans will know, but maybe the British audience is not so aware of, but it was published during Vietnam, so that it was a book about the Second World War that arrived in another moment of huge political turmoil and huge kind of increased kind of controversy for such a book. And Vonnegut became famous because he became this kind of anti-Vietnam writer, which he certainly wasn't. He was trying to write about the Second World War, and by the time he published it, this other thing had happened. And that's certainly true of a lot of the work in our show. We included works in the show about Crimea and the Ukraine a long time before fighting then broke out there. So a few years ago that we decided we wanted to show this work. And I think that sense of the sort of relentless recycling and return to conflict in certain places, it isn't a reason for not trying to understand it. And I think the understanding is super important. And an art museum can't take a political stance and say, and in fact we've tried not to make this out to be an anti-war show in that sort of sense, but by framing it, and it's very, very, very heavily and clearly framed by Vonnegut, we're trying to associate ourselves with his position, which is that in the face of something this complex, this baffling, this traumatic, you could make an effort to understand it, and you could do something interesting and different rather than continuing to make the same mistakes over and over again, or continuing to describe things in the same ways over and over again. And I think the artists in the show, the photographers in the show, they remind us that there are these many, many different ways of dealing with these subjects. And that, I think, is the positive message of the show. I mean, the show is essentially about very, very problematic, troubling, and often maybe quite depressing subjects. But the range of approaches and the range of commitment on the part of the people who make the work, that's really heartening, I think. And it's really good to see young artists, people at the beginning of their career, committed to making work with great passion and with great kind of political insight and with great historical sensitivity. That's a good thing.